Welcome back. We are going to talk today about a really serious problem throughout the world, something called undernutrition. So, of course, world hunger is a real big problem. And so the things we're going to talk about today, what are the characteristics of hunger? What's the definition of food security? There's going to be several different terms I want you to know, and one of those is nutrition security. What are the results of chronic hunger, along with what's the primary cause of undernutrition, and at which stage of the life cycle is undernutrition especially damaging? What are the effects of chronic undernutrition? So we're going to go over each and every one of these questions. So there are going to be some terms that I want you to know, such as hunger. And of course, this is pretty obvious. It's the physiological state that results when not enough food is eaten to meet the energy needs of the person. And then malnutrition is a condition of impaired development or function, and it's caused by either a deficiency of food or an excess, which kind of seems weird because we think of malnutrition as only undernutrition, but it can also be what we would call overnutrition. So undernutrition is when the food supply is insufficient to meet the needs of a population. Overnutrition is when there's excess amounts of food leading to overconsumption of that food. Then famine, which we're going to go over. This is when there's an extreme shortage of food leading to massive starvation of a population. And then food insecurity. And then, of course, we'll talk about food security. But food insecurity is a condition of anxiety about running out of food or money even to be able to buy that food. So some of the effects of hunger that a population would have, of course, for the person, reduced energy, diminished concentration, impaired ability to learn. You know what it's like when you're hungry. It's hard to study, it's hard to concentrate, all of those good things. But imagine long-term hunger, where you're going to have a population that has lowered productivity because they're in this continuous lack of energy state. And then this is going to lead to chronic health conditions, increased susceptibility to infection and disease, and then slower recovery from that illness or even from an injury because the immune system isn't working or the body doesn't have the nutrients it needs to repair the injury. And then, of course, when we're talking about pregnant women, this can lead to lower birth weights, which, by the way, a decrease in birth weight is the number one cause of death of infants, and then decreased growth in those infants as well as in children. And, when we talk about hunger, we're not just talking about places in Africa. The world's population, they're all kinds of places where hunger exists. And so we're going to talk about how hunger can exist in some of these places where the world seems to have enough money. So nutritional insecurity and malnutrition, we can have something referred to as hidden hunger. And this is where a couple of things occur. One, you have micronutrient deficiencies. And of course, we've talked about these micronutrients. These are our vitamins and our minerals. And of course, it's hard to tell if somebody's not getting enough vitamin and minerals on a daily basis. In North America, malnutrition can be accompanied by things such as eating disorders, alcohol disorders, unavailable or even inadequate caregiving. So you have parents who, maybe they're working too much, or you have individuals who the parents are alcoholics themselves and they're not able to care for their children or even care for the elderly in the house, or even care for themselves for that matter. Homelessness, this also leads to malnutrition issues. In the United States, 12% of the population, which is about 15 million people, experience food insecurities. And again, we're going to talk about these insecurities. And poverty seems to be the primary driver of this malnutrition. So when we talk about poverty, it can lead to other things. So poor people may eat and absorb too little nutritious foods, making them more prone to disease. You have inadequate or inappropriate food leads to stunted development, premature death. Disease decreases people's ability to cultivate or even purchase nutritious foods. If you have too many people in a population who's sick, who's going to grow the food? Who's going to go to the store to buy the food? Nutrient deficient diets provoke health problems. Undernutrition increases the disease, like we talked about, sickness and loss of livelihood, of course, even leading to death. So nutrition security. So for a people to feel like they're secure, they're going to need access to food. There has to be enough food available for them to have the appropriate nutrients. And, what that means is there has to be enough also variety of food. You can't have just feeding a population rice, okay? They're going to have a variety of food. And then a big deal is stability of the food supply. So that means from the farmer all the way to shipment, all the way to getting it to the person, whether it's a grocery store or whatever it may be. And I mean, right now we're in, as I'm making this video, in the time of COVID, and one of the issues is the supply chain. And we're having problems not necessarily with food availability, but with food actually being delivered so that people can purchase that food. And last year, tons of food by farmers was plowed under and never received by people because the food supply chain has been disrupted. There aren't enough workers, there aren't enough ways to deliver, and this is a problem in other countries as well, and not just in the time of COVID. So people require physical, social, economic access to have that nutritional food, the food that meets their everyday dietary needs. And of course, appropriate nutritious diet also needs to be accompanied by sanitation. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, but there has to be the right ability to cook the food. There has to be the availability of clean water. All of this is necessary for a healthy population. So malnutrition and micronutrition deficiencies, okay? So malnutrition, again, can be all about low food supply, and maybe you have a large population, not enough food to go around, and this undernutrition leads to disease. And of course, we've already talked about this. The child can't grow, or there's wasting away because of disease, or let's say muscle mass, for instance. I'm not eating enough protein in my diet. I can't keep the muscle mass on my body. Also, with malnutrition, you might have ample food and excess intake of food, which we would call overnutrition, and that leads to potentially obesity. And then, this is a big problem in developing countries, not just the United States, but places like the United Kingdom and different places in Europe, where there's a lot of food available, but not necessarily all of this food is nutritious food. And so we're eating too much of this with too many calories, not enough exercise going along. And so now it leads to diseases of overnutrition. And this would be like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and such. And then, of course, malnutrition also, we talked about, could be those micronutrient deficiencies or that hidden hunger. Critical micronutrients missing in a diet: iron, vitamin A, iodine, zinc, B vitamins, selenium, vitamin C. And we've talked about a lot of these and how they're used in the human body in this class, in other videos. And so you'll know that these are very important. So we're just going to kind of touch on a few of the diseases that have to do with these micronutrient deficiencies that people experience worldwide. And this is still experienced, unfortunately, some of these in the United States. So, for instance, vitamin E problems can cause what's called xerophthalmia. This is blindness from chronic eye infections or dryness, restricted growth, keratinization of the epithelial tissue. Now, this is not really seen in the United States. This is where you're going to see populations that have a lot of nutrition issues like Asia, Africa, and we know that fortified foods. We fortify a lot of foods with vitamin A in this country and in other countries, like milk, for instance. But other things like sweet potatoes, spinach, different greens, apricots, cantaloupe, carrots, those are all good sources of vitamin A. Rickets. Now, that used to be a huge issue in the United States because it was a lack of vitamin D. You couldn't calcify bones appropriately. And you used to see a lot of people in the US with bone deformities until we started to fortify our milk with vitamin D. Of course, things like fish oil and sun exposure are good to increase vitamin D in the body. We still, again, see these issues of rickets in Asia, Africa, parts of the different world where, in like the Middle East, where women cover completely and they're not exposed to the sunshine like they should be. Thiamine deficiency, we talked about beriberi before. This is a nerve degeneration, and there's problems with muscle coordination, cardiovascular disease. And again, we see this in a lot of times in war-torn countries, especially, which we'll talk about, where war leads to famine. But we do see beriberi in alcoholics. So that is something that you see sometimes in the US. Araboflavinosis, which is a decrease in riboflavin. This can cause inflammation of the oral cavity, different nervous system disorders. And again, we typically see this in famine, any place where a country is experiencing that. Sunflower seeds, pork, enriched grains, dried beans, all good. Oh, excuse me, those are for beriberi. For riboflavin, you're talking about milk, mushrooms, spinach, liver, and of course, again, enriched grains. Pellagra, which is a niacin deficiency. This causes the 4Ds, if you remember: diarrhea, dermatitis, dementia, and death. We can see mushrooms, tuna, beef, peanuts. These are all going to assist with that problem. We don't really see pellagra anywhere in the United States. Megaloblastic anemia is a decrease in folate, and this is where our red blood cells are enlarged, and this can lead to fatigue and weakness. Now, this can occur in the United States, although you don't see a vast majority of the population having this issue. It also, in pregnant women, we know that a lack of folate can lead to issues with the unborn. Green leafy vegetables, oranges, liver, this all assists in increasing folate levels. Scurvy. Now, we see scurvy in the United States sometimes, especially in people who are alcoholics. But of course, again, this is in places where famine is occurring and there aren't a lot of fruits and vegetables, because this is where we get most of our vitamin C, which is what a lack of vitamin C causes scurvy. And anything that is going to be affected by connective tissue growth is affected by vitamin C. So low vitamin C delays wound healing, can cause internal bleeding, problems with the bones, problems with the teeth. Again, a lot of people have access in the US to fruits and vegetables, so we don't see this in the majority of the population, just people who are not eating appropriately. Iron deficiency anemia, this is everywhere. People have this issue all the time. And this is usually, again, just due to not eating products that are high in iron, like red meats, for instance, seafood, broccoli, peas, bran, whole grains. These all have iron in it. And of course, iron is going to help us to carry oxygen. And so without enough iron, we're very fatigued. We don't feel like doing anything. And then, of course, it also affects pregnancies, and it can increase growth retardation in the unborn. A goiter, lack of iodine. We know that this is from an enlargement to, or causes, I should say, an enlargement to the thyroid gland. And in the unborn, it can lead to mental retardation, and it can also lead to other congenital issues. And then, of course, in the unborn, they can develop hypothyroidism. Now, we do fortify our salt in the United States with iodine. And so most people don't have any type of iodine deficiencies in the US, but we do see this in South America, Eastern Europe, and Africa. Now, another issue is what we would call semi-starvation. So people have food, but they don't have enough food and they don't have it for long periods of time. Now, initially, because they're just really hungry, you might not see any visible symptoms or signs in these people, except for a lot of fatigue, a lot of sleeping. But then as time goes on, you're going to see other issues. So for instance, it reduces reproductive capacity. It weakens the immune system. Of course, they have very low energy, so they don't feel like doing any work. They have a hard time thinking, so reduced mental capacity. And then, of course, one of the things is if you start to check their labs, check their blood to see what's going on, you may not see any real changes in the beginning to any of those micronutrients we've talked about. But as time progresses, you'll see all of those levels start to drop. And then, of course, these individuals can develop severe diseases. Famine, this is something that is going to happen due to crop failure. Usually we see in countries that experience famine, there has been war, there's political issues. And when that happens, for instance, let's say you have a country like the Republic of the Congo. They've had issues with this in the past, and they have a coup of their government. And now the new government comes in, and they are trying to take over land. And now farmers are displaced, and this leads to crop failure. It leads to famine. And of course, because of this, you have a lot of loss of life. Now, one of the other issues that we see that has started to kind of creep in slowly is climate change. And I know there's a lot of politics behind climate change, but we do see climate change as far as farming is concerned. We see there's a lot less water, and that issue with water and the availability of water causes issues. Now, of course, in the farming community, one of the other issues is taking care of the soil. So is it climate change, or is it the way that we farm that is creating these issues? And soil is a huge problem. And so if you look, for instance, in the continent of Asia, like especially in China, China has a huge farming community, and of course they have a very large land mass. So you would think that China would be able to produce tons and tons and tons of food, but there's an issue in the way that they farm, and because they don't take care of their soil, what we're seeing in China is about 1 acre of farmland a year is actually not a year. Let me back up. About 1 acre of farmland per month is turning into desert. And this is happening in more than just China. So we're seeing a lot of soil erosion. We're seeing a lot of issues. Now, China, of course, to their credit, they are trying to do a lot to reclaim that desert and to turn it back into good soil to be able to farm again. But we don't see that as much in other countries. And so this creates all kinds of economic chaos. It creates all kinds of food unrest, you might say. So, some strategies across the world where they're trying to address these nutrient deficiencies is, of course, supplementing food, okay, or fortifying foods. So, we're trying to add various vitamins, various nutrients to the food. And what this is doing is, of course, allowing the population not to have to worry about as many different types of food stuff to have to eat. So we're creating more ready to use foods with these fortifications or these supplements within the food. And of course, there's a lot of controversy about that. Are these foods as healthy? But again, the issue is farming practices. You don't have as many farmers. There's plenty of land in the world, but there are not plenty of farmers. And for many, many years, the world has said, well, corporate farms are the way to go. But what has happened in these corporate farms is they have decreased the number of crops that they are farming. So for instance, if you look at a grocery store today in the United States and you compare it to a grocery store, let's say 50 years ago, the number of choices that you have as far as fresh fruits and fresh vegetables has decreased significantly because you have these corporate farms where they're only farming, like one farm only farms corn and another farm only farms potatoes, and you don't see the types of various veggies that farmers used to produce, and people had the ability to farm unique vegetables that maybe somebody else wasn't farming and they could make a lot of money off of, but that's just not happening anymore. And so what they're hoping to do is they're hoping to make all these ready-made foods so the population isn't as sickly, isn't as undernourished. So nutritional requirements, of course, are really high for pregnancy and infants and children. And so we're going to talk about how this affects those different rates of development. So now in the United States in particular, so we're going to really focus in on this for a little while and then we'll go worldwide again. We're going to talk about what are the primary food assistance programs that have come into being since the 1960s and what factors influence the presence of poverty, homelessness, and undernutrition, and what programs have been launched recently to provide long-term solutions to hunger. So again, about 15% of our population live at or below poverty level, which is about 45 million people. That's pretty significant. The annual income of these individuals are about $23,850 for a family of four. That is not much money in the United States to live off of. Now, depending on where you're living, it might be a little bit better than other places, but you're still actually talking about a very, very low level of income, which means 21% of children in the United States are living in poverty. 65 and older, the poverty level, the number of people are increasing. The highest rate of poverty among Blacks, then that's followed by Hispanics, Asians, and then whites in this country. Now, the highest level, and really this is what your book says, the highest level is actually the Native Americans. But that's kind of funny because when we think about different populations, we always seem to leave out the Native Americans. Food insecure households face difficult choices between purchasing food and housing or paying for medication, paying for utilities, paying for transportation. It's kind of interesting because when you're poor, and I can tell you I grew up poor, my family was extremely poor, and it took a long time for me to work my way out of poverty. And I can remember thinking, okay, I have to pay my rent, I have to pay my utilities, so I'm not going to pay for food. I'm not going to buy anything to eat right now. I'll survive. I'll be okay. I'm sure I'm not going to starve to death, but I have to make that choice. And it seems like when you're poor, when you're living in poverty, food seems to be something that you can get rid of. And if you have children, you still have to pay that rent and you still have to pay those utilities, and so you try really hard to make it and to make sure that they're nourished, but you do make decisions even with your children not to feed them quite how you might feed them if you had enough money. So in the United States, this seems to be very related to politics. It seems to be related to socioeconomics, and we don't have a scarcity of food in this country. We have plenty of farmland, but again, in this country, in the United States, most of our farms are corporate farms. We have very few small farmers anymore, and a lot of this is taken care of by politics. And it's kind of interesting because we have a lot of billionaires who are buying up farmland and they're buying up water. And there should be no reason that food is scarce. And there should be absolutely no reason that food costs as much as it does in this country. But if you don't have farmers, how do you provide the food? You know, something to think about is if we were really concerned, maybe we should be teaching people how to feed themselves. Maybe we should be teaching people how to have their own gardens. I met a woman one time. She lived in an apartment. It was just a small one-bedroom apartment. And she bought very little food for her family, but that's because she provided the food. She had small garden boxes all over that apartment. And she even actually had 2 chickens inside her apartment. They lived in a cute little cage that she made for them, and she kept them very clean. And her chickens provided eggs for protein, and those garden boxes provided a ton of vegetables. She even had a fruit tree or 2. I remember her having an apple tree and an orange tree, little tiny dwarf things. And it was amazing how much food she provided for her family. And there were 3 of them. She had 2 sons and herself. And she told me she paid very little for food. And it was just her way. She had come from the Caribbean and she had grown up on a farm, and she knew how to feed herself. She knew how to grow her food. And maybe if we all learned how to plant a garden in our backyard at a young age, and we all learned how to be little farmers, we would be able to not have to worry about this so much. So one of the things that the United States government has done is they've come up with what's called Women, Infants, and Children. This is the WIC program, where women have to go to meetings and they have to be taught about nutrition, and then they get these coupons, and these coupons allow them to only purchase certain types of food that the government deems nutritious for the family. And, certain things like orange juice, which we know is good for vitamin C, but also very high in iron, and different types of milks and so on. And there's also, of course, breakfast and lunch programs, and a large number of children every single day go to school, and these are the only meals that they receive in a day are the breakfast and lunch that they get at their school. There's also what's called the SNAP program. This used to be called food stamps, but now we call it Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And of course, really, these are electronic benefit cards now, the EBT cards, where you can go and buy food on these cards. And of course, this comes from the government and is given to people depending on their income. There's also elderly nutrition services. So there's like Meals on Wheels, where there's home delivery. And then, of course, there's church meals, that kind of thing, where the elderly can go and receive at least one nutritious meal a day. Now, in 2009, there was something called the Recovery Act, where this was a stimulus package to increase the variety of food benefits and services given to people so that people were able to receive more food benefits, more food assistance. Also, we have a lot of people who donate to charities, and these charities are able to donate foods. A lot of these come through the Salvation Army and through various church organizations. Unemployment, medical housing expenses, holiday shopping cause a household to be hungry or food insecure. It's really funny because I remember, like I told you, I grew up very poor as a child, and I can remember my parents having the thought that it was more important to buy us presents for Christmas than to feed us. And I can remembering my parents spending more money than they had at Christmas time, and then we had little to no food. And we ended up, because of the spending procedures of my parents, we ended up losing our home, and it happens. And I think some of it is that, people who are very poor, they feel very guilty. They can't give their children things, and, you want to give them something at holidays, and you don't care about the long-term ramifications if you spend too much money. And that can be difficult on the children later on. So these are just some of the federally subsidized programs. I've put them in, we've talked about SNAP and the EBT cards, WIC, National Lunch Program, breakfast, that kind of thing. Child and adult care food programs. There's different types of programs through the USDA. Depending on the community you're in, your community may or may not have these different programs. The Meals on Wheels, summer food assistance programs, because sometimes, you'll have children who don't go to school in the summertime. And so some of these schools in the neighborhoods will continue to serve breakfast and lunch. There's different types of food distributions, especially like I told you, the Indian reservations, very, very low income households. And a lot of those micronutrient deficiencies that I said really don't happen in the United States, well, they do happen on the Indian reservations. So you'll see unusual nutrient deficiencies because there's such high poverty there. And then, of course, there are some programs to be able to supply fresh fruits and vegetables to low-income schools. So some of the socioeconomic factors related to undernutrition: persistence, hunger, food insecurities. Again, this is mainly in households that are stricken with poverty and a lot of homelessness. And so, you're typically not going to see a household that's well off that is going to have nutrient deficiencies. What you will see is the malnutrition problem of overnutrition. Now, of course, another issue is if I were to ask you, can you guess what the number one food product is that is purchased with the EBT card, with this under the SNAP program? Could you guess the number one food product? And I'm not sure if you'd be able to guess this, but it's soda. And so even though you might be providing individuals with the ability to purchase food because they're living in poverty, it doesn't necessarily mean that the individual is going to purchase the appropriate food that is nutritious, okay? Of course, one of the things is when you're living in poverty, a lot of depression goes with that. And so the number two food substance that's purchased is candy and snacks. So you have sodas number one and candy and snacks number two. And of course, now you still have nutrition issues. And whether it's, I feel bad, I'm depressed, I want to eat this junk food, or whether it could just simply be, I don't understand how to eat appropriately, because We don't really teach, we don't teach that gardening, we don't teach that farming, and we certainly don't teach nutrition from elementary school on. So it's really a big issue in the United States that we're not teaching how to eat appropriately. And then, of course, homelessness. How are you going to eat appropriately if you're homeless? You don't have a kitchen to cook in. You don't have a refrigerator to keep your food in. You don't have the money to purchase these types of things. And of course, undernutrition, big deal for that. So poverty is characterized as situational or generational. So this means it could be that, someone's living in poverty right now just because, well, I lost my job. And so I have this hopefully short-term issue. So that's situational. Or you do have generations of people who are living in poverty. And so this could be just because you have families who don't know how to get out of this. They don't have the education that they need. They're unskilled workers. They're being paid a very low wage for what they do. Or maybe the individual is an illegal immigrant, and so they have to take these low paid jobs because they're doing it under the table. They're not supposed to be here, and so they can't be found out. And then, of course, in the United States, we have a very large and ever increasing number of one or single parent households where you don't have that dual income. And of course, it makes it much more difficult to live, and especially here in the state of California. So another thing, situational poverty, we talk about the 7 Ds. This could be divorce, death in the family, so maybe death of your spouse, disease, downsizing, because your company's laying off, you're disabled, some kind of disaster has happened, or you're in huge debt and you don't have any idea how to crawl out of it. Like, for instance, they're giving all of these fresh high school graduates these major credit cards, and they don't know how to use it. And by the time they're 25 years old, they're $150,000 in debt. How are they going to climb out of this? What are they going to do? How many years is that going to take at 25, 30% interest for that individual to get out of it? And so many of these people, they have to go bankrupt. And how long? 7, 10 years before they get out of that situation. So they might be 35, 40 years old before they even have the ability to become stable. Food access is another big deal. And depending on where you live, if you live in a big city, that might not be a big deal. But if you're living in a more impoverished neighborhood, that can be huge. Like, for instance, I know this happened many years ago, but you might remember the Rodney King riots. Well, one of the big deals after those riots, there were a lot of fires and many neighborhoods burned down. And for many, many years after that, grocery stores refused to build in those neighborhoods. And because there were no grocery stores, people didn't have access to food. And they would have to walk or drive for miles to be able to get food. And that's where the term food deserts came from. And eventually the government had to step in and say, hey, let me give you all these incentives to build grocery stores in these neighborhoods. So there were a bunch of initiatives that said, we want new grocery stores. We want you to bring in farmers markets. And this was in all parts of the United States, not just in LA. And I just named a few, like Let's Move, a healthy food financing initiative. That's where they were actually paying these mom and pop stores to come and bring their stores into the neighborhoods to be able to provide these foods. I live in a very small community, and luckily for this community, there is a market, and I see people, they will get on their bicycle and they will ride for miles to go to this one particular market. Now, if this market wasn't part of the community I live in, I don't know that many of the elderly even the young people who live out here. It's a very, very poor community. And I don't know that they would be able to get groceries because our closest grocery store is over 30 miles away after that. And it's bad enough that they're coming on their bicycles or they're walking, and I see them pulling little wagons behind them in order to be able to carry their groceries home. So having a grocery store in these communities is extremely important. And of course, we talked about homelessness. 20% increase in homelessness has occurred since 2007 in the United States. And a lot of that has to do with the housing crisis that occurred 2007, 2008. Many people lost their homes, and they haven't been able to recoup this. With children, there's 2 times more likelihood with homeless children to experience hunger, and more than 575,000 adults in the United States are homeless at any given moment. So we do have a lot of chronic homelessness where people are homeless for long periods of time. And, if you go into the homeless communities, you'll notice that mainly they're older men, mainly they're non-white males who are unemployed. But a lot of our homeless community are also people who have mental disorders. And so they can't hold down a job. They don't know what to do with themselves. And we really don't have the facilities to care for individuals who really need that kind of care. And so they become homeless. So with homelessness, some of the causes, of course, the high cost housing, and the subsidies for this housing has decreased significantly since 2007. Low-income families are likely to spend more than half of their income on rent. And depending on where you're at, it could be more than that. And, like I said, we have a lot of mentally ill patients who are out on the street, a lot of people who have alcohol and drug-related illnesses as well. All right, so some of the solutions for hunger in the U.S., again, government-funded food assistance programs. Some of these, they begin and then they expire, so it just depends on what year you're talking about. Of course, there's food pantries, shelters. They're building more and more shelters, but it just really depends on what city you live in, if it's a big city versus a little city. Now, here's a big issue, which I just don't understand this. But of course, when you have a lawsuit happy society, okay, I get it. But I think it's terrible. Food sharing. So there are more and more bans for food sharing. And what I mean by that is not like you and me go out and share our food with somebody who's homeless. But once upon a time, it used to be that restaurants, at the end of the day, they would have more food, and they would give the food to the homeless community. So you might be a homeless person, and at the end of the day, McDonald's is going to have hamburgers and French fries ready, right? And so you go to McDonald's and they give you a big sack of hamburgers and French fries or salad or whatever they have left over. And I don't mean it's somebody else's food that they didn't eat. It's the food that the restaurant has left over. But now in the state of California, you can't do that. It's illegal. As a restaurant, I cannot share my food with the homeless community. They used to also be able to even go to the dumpsters of those restaurants or various different places like grocery stores, and they used to go dumpster diving, and they would get the extra food. And that is something that they're banning, you might say. Is not that it's illegal necessarily. Well, yeah, kind of. You're not supposed to get into somebody else's dumpster. But a lot of these places are putting locks on those dumpsters so that you can't get in there. And a lot of states are making it illegal, but a lot of restaurants are afraid they're going to get sued. They don't want to give that food. This is just, it's a waste, and it's really quite a shame. The Healthy Food Financing Initiative, this is what we were talking about before, making sure there's plenty of grocery stores. And of course, anybody can be affected by this poverty. You have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. So being able to have access to food and food supply is extremely important, whether it's the food chain or whether it's a farmer or whether it's you being able to grow and provide your own food. And, I have a small farm and we grow a lot of our own food here. And I will tell you, we've lived on the same piece of property for almost 25 years. And when we first started, we knew very little about how to do this farming thing. And we thought it was going to be a piece of cake. You put a seed in the ground and you water it and it grows. But that's not even remotely true. There's a ton that you have to learn. We bought chickens and we bought other animals and we thought you buy a chicken and you feed it and it's okay. And again, that's not true. And you have to learn how to deal with disease and you have to know what the right type of chicken for your environment is. And there again is a lot to learn. And we live in a community where there are not a lot of farmers, and so there weren't a lot of people to ask. And it was harsh. It was harsh for many years to try to figure out how to make this work. And so it would be really great if we could start teaching people at a much younger age, and of course provide more services to people who do want to farm, because there's very little out there to help people as far as knowledge base is concerned who want to start farming. So let's get from just the United States to this undernutrition throughout the world. There's about 900 million people who are malnourished in the world. And 1 in 9 people worldwide are chronically undernourished. They don't have enough food. And over 800 million people worldwide are uncertain about where their next meal is going to come from. They have tremendous food insecurities, which of course we've already talked about. Increases the risk of disease, increases the risk of death. The United Nations developed what's called the Food and Agricultural Organization. This is like the group that goes around the world and looks at who's undernourished, what does this mean? And they came up with the 4 pillars of food security, which are availability, access, utilization, and stability. And we're going to go through all of this as we go along.